Hello, my name is Sam Odom. As Terry said, I'm the director of the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. And I'm going to talk today about evidence-based practices and their use within classrooms for students with autism spectrum disorders. The presentation today is a part of the work that we're doing through the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders. It's a university center designed to promote use of EBPs for children and adolescents with autism spectrum disorders. It's funded by the Office of Special Education Programs, and it's a 5-year grant, and we're in the fourth of our 5 years. We're a collaborative project. We work across universities. As I said, I'm at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Ann Cox is the director of our location in Chapel Hill. We also collaborate with the Mind Institute, which is at the University of California at Davis. And Sally Rogers and Sally Ozanoff are the directors, principal investigators at that site. And then also the Weizmann Center at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Lynn Abadudo and Linda Tuckman are the principal investigators at that site. The goals of our national center are to promote development, learning, and achievement of children with ASD through the use of evidence-based practices, to increase the state capacity to implement evidence-based practices, to support the implementation of evidence-based practices, and to increase the number of individuals, teachers, related service individuals who work with students with ASD. We have been, we're located now in 12 states. We've added states across the years of our project. And the states are distributed across the country, and you can see on this slide the range of states that we're working with of course, Virginia being the state that entered during the third year of our project. The need for professional development in states related to ASD is pushed by several factors. There's an increasing number of students identified as having ASD and qualifying for special education services. This pushes school systems and states to provide training related specifically to effective practices for students with autism. There's an emerging database about the practices that are most effective for students with ASD. And that database serves as a basis for which professional development can be provided. The prevalence rates, as you know, have increased from 2 in 2000 in the 1980s to 1 in 150 in 2009, and that prevalence rate is even higher now. With that, there's been a dramatic increase of students that with ASD that are entering the schools, with the numbers increasing substantially from 1991 when autism was identified as an eligibility category, to 2004 when the latest data are available. A number of organizations have examined the efficacy of practices or the effectiveness of practices in generating positive outcomes for students with ASD. The National Academy of Sciences in 2000 did a review of educational practices and identified a certain set of principles that underlie effective programs. The National Standards Project that's located at the National Autism Center also has identified evidence-based practices, and I'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. There have been a range of reviews and chapters and syntheses of research literature that are generating very practical effects, very practical recommendations about strategies that may be appropriate for students with ASD. And also, in general, in education, there's a push, there's a push toward basing instructional strategies and curriculum on evidence of their effectiveness. So this, the movement to identify and to support the use of evidence-based practices for students with autism goes beyond just special education and fits very much into the evidence-based movement in education. With that impetus within education, with that initiative in education, comes the challenge for teachers using evidence-based practices. In many states, there's a lack of specific training related to autism. There may not be access. Here in Virginia, there's a lot of activity and interest, as evidenced by the ACE project, that is providing opportunities for professional development. One of the challenges is just innovation, introducing innovation or new practices within school systems that have provided services in the same way for a long period of time. So change in school systems often is an issue. We know that in order for teachers to be able to use practices in classrooms and schools and programs, it requires support that both in terms of coaching, administration, and all of those lead to sustainability or practices continuing to be used over time. I want to talk just a minute about the difference between two classes of strategies used for students with ASD. There are a set of programs called comprehensive treatment models that I'm going to talk about in just a minute, and I'm going to contrast those with focused intervention practices, which will make up the discussion, most of the discussion that I'll have today. Comprehensive treatment models are packages of practices that fit together within a conceptual framework. They're made up of multiple components, and so they may include child-focused instruction, family-focused support. They are broad in scope. Comprehensive treatment strategies are broad in scope in that they may address different developmental domains and actually go across domains, so that they will include strategies for promoting, for example, communication, social competence, repetitive, challenging behaviors. They're intense in nature in that they often occur over an entire instructional day and then days across the year, and they may occur across multiple settings. So examples of comprehensive treatment models are the Denver model, and developed by Sally Rogers. The Early Start Denver model is the most current example of that strategy. The LEAP program, developed by Phil Strain, which is an inclusive early intervention program for preschool children that goes up to kindergarten age and includes typically developing kids. The Lovas Institute, which is a development from which was developed from the UCLA Young Autism Project and focuses on first discrete trial training that then moves to different forms of training as the child advances. The May Institute, which follows an applied behavior analysis approach, as does the Princeton Child Development Institute and the pivotal response training or pivotal response treatment program that established by the Kegels. All of these are comprehensive in the sense that they incorporate a number of focused intervention practices in a way that creates a larger treatment package. Today, those are contrasted with focused intervention practices that are more limited in scope and are teaching strategies that are directed specifically towards skills. Focused intervention practices target one or a limited number of outcomes, so it's a teaching strategy that you might that you as a teacher or service provider might use to focus or to address a specific goal that a student may have, like using questions in a conversation, or responding to directions, or independently making a transition within a classroom. The strategies are conducted over a shorter period of time than CTMs. They are implemented within classrooms, and there may be actually multiple focused intervention practices that are used within a classroom day. Practices are selected based on goals for children and their IEPs. Examples of these practices include discrete trial training, peer-mediated intervention. So I want to make that determination because school systems sometimes adopt a complete comprehensive treatment model and use that model, all of that model, to provide services for students. Or, in contrast, they may adopt an approach in which focused intervention practices are selected for individual children based on goals that were developed by IEP teams. And that's what I'm going to, so I'm going to be talking about the latter today, the focused intervention practices that have been identified as being evidence-based in nature. When the National Professional Development Center on ASD began, we intended to, our mandate was to identify evidence-based practices and promote their use in schools. We originally intended to work with the National Standards Project and use the practices that they were identifying at the time. The National Standards Project was conducting a very comprehensive review of the research literature to identify practices that efficacious or evidence-based practices. But the time when we needed to get going, which in 2007, they had not yet completed their review, and we needed to begin. So we conducted a review on a smaller amount of the literature. That is, the literature the research literature that had occurred 10 years previous to when we started our review in 2007. So it was a review from 2007 to 1997. So one of the questions that we first confronted, or individuals confront about evidence-based practice, is what actually counts as evidence. So, like this young man is asking the teacher in this probably fourth, third, second grade classroom, this multiplication table thing, has it been peer reviewed? By peer review, we mean practices that were identified in research articles, and for which the research reports that they're effective when used with students with ASD. They follow methodologies that are designed to establish a causal relationship, or to prove that the practice actually has an effect on students. And they follow experimental designs, quasi-experimental design. The studies follow experimental design, group experimental designs, quasi-experimental designs, and also single subject designs. To begin our work in examining evidence-based practices, we established criteria for selection of studies. That is, we looked at let me start that slide just over again. To begin the review of the literature, we established criteria for selecting research studies, studies that in which there was a clear design, in which there were students with autism who served as participants, and studies that focused on intervention. We conducted a very thorough review of that 10-year studies in that 10-year period that I just mentioned, and we, through the process, focused on selecting practices that had sufficient evidence and practical utility. For a practice to be called evidence-based, it had to be supported by 2 group design studies, or at least 5 single case design studies. There could be a combination of evidence that included 1 group design study and 3 single case design studies. The point being that there are levels, there are criteria within the field that suggests that this is a sufficient level of evidence for us to have confidence that a practice, when implemented well, may have a positive effect for students with ASD. The review of the literature began with an examination of studies that produced outcomes that are important for students with ASD. So outcomes related to their social abilities, their communication skills, the repetitive or problem behavior, adaptive behavior, academic skills. Those are the kind of instructional needs that are important for the range of students with ASD, at least that we've worked with. We identified and grouped interventions that addressed these skills, and we looked for similar interventions across skill domains and age levels, and I'll talk about that more in just a minute. So that process for sorting was an interesting one. It's sort of like you see Moses here in this cartoon when he says, hey, wait, number 17 of the commandments. Number 17 is the same as number 3, and number 12 is the same as number 6, and number 4 is practically the same as number 2. So in order to get to 10 commandments, Moses had to do a little content analysis and some shaping of practices too, under divine guidance, no doubt. And that process we followed also. That is, we looked at the procedures that were identified as within method sections, and we looked at similar strategies that were being used, and we grouped them in that way. Sometimes they were clearly labeled as a specific type of practice, and sometimes there were practices that followed that had different names but followed the similar procedures. But out of that review, we identified 24 practices that had sufficient evidence to allow us to call them evidence-based. And those practices have been the basis for our professional development training that we've done over the last 4 years. The practices consist of primarily applied behavior analysis strategies, although there are a few that move beyond the area of applied behavior analysis. There were some specific sort of foundational practices that rose to the top. Foundational in the sense that they are applied behavior analysis approaches, and they're used in some of the other strategies that you'll hear about in a minute. But prompting, time delay, reinforcement, task analysis, or chaining, all have a very solid basis of evidence of their effectiveness. Strategies for decreasing problem behaviors also were identified. Now, positive behavior support is an intervention approach that many use with students with ASD, and that in combination is probably very effective. When we looked at the literature to identify specific studies that used what was called a positive behavior support approach, we didn't find studies that did just that. But what we did find were a set of focused intervention practices that make up a package that is usually called PBS, or positive behavior support. So functional behavior assessment was a strategy that we found sufficient evidence for. Stimulus control and environmental arrangements was a second strategy. Actually, we have changed the terminology. We now call this antecedent-based interventions, but these are the strategies used to prevent a behavior from occurring. And in a PBS format or conceptualization, these are sort of the tier 1 approaches that prevent behavior problems from occurring. Response, interruption, and redirection was another evidence-based practice that we located. Also, probably would fit into that tier 1 level. Extinction is another practice that is removal of reinforcement for problem behaviors. Those extinction strategies often being based on a functional behavior assessment that's occurred previously. Differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, incompatible behaviors, low-rate behaviors, that is, reinforcing behaviors that may take the place of problem behaviors were another strategy that was identified. These being often tier 3 type of strategies that are used in positive behavior support packages. Functional communication training also was a strategy that was identified, often grouped within positive behavior support packages. The functional communication training trains communication skills that may take the place of aberrant or problem behaviors, challenging behaviors. And usually it also includes some element of extinction. Discrete trial training as a specific practice also has strong support within the research literature. Now, discrete trial training is often associated with LOVOS and sort of the LOVOS model. And in the comprehensive treatment model that I mentioned a few minutes ago, it is very much a feature, as it is of other the comprehensive treatment models. As a focused intervention practice, a teacher may decide to use discrete trial training to teach a specific child a specific skill in their classroom without adopting that complete comprehensive treatment model that I mentioned before. The naturalistic interventions are a set of practices that go under other names. So activity-based instruction or incidental teaching are strategies that you may be familiar with. That milieu language training is another strategy that we grouped within the naturalistic intervention classification. So naturalistic interventions occur usually during common routines in the classroom or home or community. They involve establishing the environment to capture a child's interest and follow in a way that allows the child or encourages the child to initiate or to use the strategy that one is trying to promote. Naturalistic interventions may usually depend on natural reinforcers that work or that operate in the environment. But they're more than incidental opportunities for students to engage in a behavior or a skill or a goal that you're trying to promote. They really require planning and attention to implementation in order to be successful. Pivotal response training is another strategy that is very much like naturalistic interventions, and sometimes it's called a naturalistic approach. Pivotal response training developed by the Kegels operates under similar assumptions that there are elements within a natural environment that are interesting for children, but also that there are pivotal skills in the environment that are critical for children to acquire, and that they lead to the development of other skills. So, for example, a child being interested and initiating, engaged, is one type of skill that's identified under pivotal response training. Self-monitoring and self-management also is used often within that pivotal response training. And it also, self-management also in itself stands out as an evidence-based practice. That is, strategies that may teach a child or adolescents ways of assessing their own behavior, knowing when to engage in a behavior of interest, when to, for example, when to ask a question, how to know one is successful when engaging in the skill or the goal. Visual supports, which are very common in classrooms and which originally came out of the TEACH model, are an evidence-based practice in and of themselves. That is, without adopting that whole comprehensive treatment TEACH model, one can plan to use visual supports within classrooms. Visual supports being cues such as pictures or schedules that may be laid out across the day that prompt a child visually to engage in a behavior or to go through a sequence of behaviors. Individual work systems also are an evidence-based strategy that were identified or that are associated with the TEACH model, but in and of themselves they may be used to address specific skills, and they are built around predictability and careful delineation of a learning task that a student may independently do and may understand when that task is over and the student has been successful. Video modeling is another strategy that was identified as evidence-based. Both modeling and video modeling in a sense of observing on a videotape the student himself or herself being successful in a goal that the teacher is hoping to promote, or observing other individuals as they're successfully engaging in a goal. So, a goal such as making an appropriate social initiation within a social context. Computer-based, computer-assisted instruction, another strategy that actually has become quite elaborated over the last 3 years since we did our reviews, with technology being more portable now, students using PDAs, or the PDA technology being more available to provide prompts for students. But also computer-assisted instruction may be traditional in the sense of learning academic skills that are in which the instruction is delivered within a computer context. And VOCA or speech-generating devices are another strategy that supplement that may be used to promote students' communication with other individuals. Social skills training in groups are a strategy that for which there has again been more studies that have occurred over the last 3 years since we did our review, but social skills training may occur in a group context where students learn skills within a curriculum, or also within a naturalistic context where students may actually use those skills in an ongoing social situation. Peer-mediated interventions, there are a range of interventions designed to promote social engagement with peers initiating or providing support. Social narratives or social stories have, again, evolved over the last 10 years, but more specifically over the last 3 years. There have been a number of studies documenting their importance. And PECS, or the Picture Exchange Communication System, is another strategy for which there's considerable evidence to promote its use. What you see on this slide are those set of 24 practices that in a sort of a matrix or a table that indicates where the support, where we found the support in terms of the ages of children. And so the cells that are grayed in are those practices that were identified at specific ages as being supported. So for example, under let's go to number 9. Peer-mediated instruction. We found evidence or studies for at the early childhood level, the elementary level, and the middle school level for that specific strategy. So when a couple of things are important in looking at this slide. One is that much of the research, as you'll see, has occurred at the early childhood and elementary level, less at the middle school and high school level. And that continues today. There's much more work early on. But that doesn't mean that one cannot use these strategies in middle school and high school just because a study hasn't been conducted at that age range. The National Standards Project is another project that has focused on identifying evidence-based practices, and I mentioned that just earlier. They conducted a much broader literature review than we did, and through that literature review and systematic analysis of articles, they identified practices that were evidence-based. And I won't talk much about this today, but when we compared our practices with the ones that they had identified, that they classify a little bit differently, we find a lot of very much similarity between the two groups of practices, which for us we feel lends validity to the practices that we had identified, because we have a lot of confidence in the work that the NAC has done, and their approach was much more comprehensive in nature. So I won't talk very much about the similarities at this point. But suffice it to say that in terms of evidence base, it looks like the two primary approaches to identifying evidence-based practices through our work and the National Standards Project are yielding very similar results. So from this analysis of the literature, we, as I mentioned, we identified 24 practices, and we have created what we call briefs for each of those practices. The briefs describe the specific procedures that are used in the practice, that they provide the evidence or the specific studies that were identified that provide support for the practice. They identify the steps for implementation. That is, what specifically you need to do in order to say that you're implementing the practice well. So, for example, for the PECS program, in our work with schools and teachers, in one classroom, we talked to the teacher about the practice that they were using, and she said, yes, we do use PECS. And so we went into the classroom using our implementation checklists, and and found that they were exchanging tokens to promote communication, but many of the elements that were key to the PECS strategy, instructional practice, they weren't using. And so when we shared with them the steps in implementation of PECS, they said, in fact, well, yes, we're not actually using or doing all of the steps that are important for using this practice. So the strategies or the briefs are located on our website, and you can get to that website by just Googling National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders. It'll take you right to it. And if you go to the feature that says evidence-based practice, it will bring up a choice of evidence-based practice briefs, and you can click on that, and it'll take you to the briefs. In addition to the briefs, we have developed web-based modules that are located on the OCALI website, or the Ohio Center on Autism and Low Incidence Disorder website, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But these modules contain multiple features, and they contain the very same information that are in the briefs, except they're not in a PDF form. They're in a computer or a web-based module format. They include pre-test and post-test, contextual information, instructions, specific step-by-step instructions about how to use the practice, case examples of the practice being used, video examples of the practice being used, implementation checklists, a summary of evidence-based practices, resources. And as I mentioned, we've done these in collaboration with OCALI. They actually list or have put up our modules on their website, so you can either get to the modules through our website or through the OCALI website. And I recommend going to their website because they actually have modules that we didn't develop, but cover practices that they've also identified. It's a great resource. All of these are free. OCALI will ask you to register, but that's just because they want to keep up with who's using their website. Video examples are a key for each of our practices. We have a set of video examples that can be used both by teachers, by just going to the website, or can be used in training. And here is the web address. Again, if you Google Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence Disability, that will take you directly to their site. So when we work with teachers to use EBPs, we begin with the learner's objectives that are listed on the IEP. We guide teachers to look at both the learner's objectives and those general areas of outcomes that were important, that were identified for practices, and use that as the first step. So, for example, if a social goal exists for a student and peer-mediated intervention is one of the strategies that were identified, strategies identified, the teacher might go to that evidence-based practice as a first step in identifying a practice that would be appropriate for that goal. Implementing the practice with a high degree of fidelity is important, and that usually requires both reviewing, reading, studying the content of the website or the brief, and also working in collaboration with a coach or a supporter, individual who can support the use of that strategy in the classroom. The assessment of the learner's performance is really critical because we, even though practices may have evidence for their effectiveness, not all practices will work with all students, even if they have been identified as evidence-based. So, we encourage teachers to create their own evidence. That is, if a strategy is working, to document how well it's working, and if it's not working, to make decisions based on the data that they collect about discontinuing the use of the practice and going with another instructional approach. You'll see on this slide the outcomes that were identified for the different evidence-based practices. This is a table that we use often with teachers, again, to guide them in matching the goal that a student has, or the outcome of a goal that a student has, and the practice that's identified that might be effective. And often teachers have choices, so other information, other things come into the decision that needs to be made. Teachers use their expertise, their knowledge about teaching, their knowledge of the context, their knowledge of the student and what may work best for them, as well as the strategies that were identified. Implementation is important, so on this slide is just a brief example of one of the implementation checklists. We have these created for all of our evidence-based practices. In one state that we worked with, the teachers liked the evidence-based practices so much they baked us a cake, and believe it or not, it has this cake has all of the evidence-based practices that I just talked about on this. I recommend that you don't eat the slice of cake that says extinction. It's that little yellow slice that's over there to the right. But all the others are good. Evidence-based practices serve as one approach, or a very central approach, we believe, in providing an effective program for students. They allow teachers to build a coordinated, planful program of how to promote goals and outcomes that are on goals for students. But the practices themselves don't operate within a vacuum. Evidence-based practices, we feel, have to operate on a platform of program quality. That is, there is a larger underlying foundation that makes programs effective and makes evidence-based practices effective. So we feel that establishing program quality is actually the first step in building an evidence-based program. Program quality is the contextual features of programs that represent best practice. You might think in evidence-based practices are the specific tools that may be used for specific skills. So you might think of of program quality as sort of like a house where there's an environment that's set up to allow you to accomplish things that you want to in your home. And the evidence-based practices as specific tools or you could think of it perhaps as the furniture that, or other types of appliances that occur in your house that have very specific purposes and generate very specific outcomes. Without that program quality, that a house might provide, that kind of a quality of environment that a house might provide, those appliances and furniture are not going to accomplish the things that you want. You're not going to feel comfortable sitting in a nicely stuffed chair if the light's not right or if the heat is not on. So we feel like that quality dimension is really important, and there are a number of features of quality that we have identified as being important. They're listed on this slide. Interdisciplinary teaming is one of the key features that's listed at the top. program ecology, things happening in the classroom like the classroom environment, the structure of the classroom and schedule, the predictability of the schedule, the social climate within the classroom, curriculum instruction, communication, social relationships, independence, that is strategies to promote independence for the students, strategies that promote functional behavior and reduce challenging behavior, and assessment. All of those we think are features, general features of a classroom that are environment or program environment that it's important. And family participation is key. To assess the quality of programs, we've developed an instrument called the APERS, and it's designed to assess different dimensions of quality that I just mentioned. We've used the APERS for program evaluation, consultations, self-evaluation, professional development, all of those things. But in a professional development role, we use the APERS at the beginning of the year with teachers to assess the quality of their environment, and often we have the teachers also complete the APERS and review with the teachers those elements of their environment of their program that they may wish to change in order to accommodate either the use of evidence-based practices or to promote program quality in general. There are two forms of the APERS, an elementary and preschool form and a middle school, high school form. They're organized by domains and subdomains. They're applicable, the APERS is applicable to self-contained and to inclusive programs. It's a rating scale. It's based on a 5-point rating scale. And the results can be summarized both for program evaluation and for more formative evaluation to give feedback to teachers. We drew from a range of instruments that people have used to examine program quality and environment in classroom environments and other program environments. We're in the process of revising the APERS right now, in which we're analyzing items. We're taking the feedback that we've gotten from the last 3 years of use of the APERS, and we'll be pilot testing a new version soon. As I mentioned, both for preschool and elementary and for middle school, high school, the APERS can be used in inclusive classrooms, and it can be used in self-contained classrooms. What we found once we've gotten into programs is that classrooms are usually kind of mixed. That is, they're self-contained for part of the day and inclusive at other parts of the day. And the APERS is flexible enough to accommodate those changes. The domains, sections of the APERS, very much follow those features of program quality that I mentioned just a minute ago. So items that are related to classroom environment, structure, climate, assessment, curriculum instruction, communication, peer relationships, challenging behaviors, family involvement, teaming. All of those are in our preschool elementary version of the APERS. And you'll see on this slide that for the middle school, high school version of the APERS, the domains in which the domains of quality, each of which includes multiple items, are very much similar. The only difference is that we sort of adjusted the wording. We've identified elements that may exist in high school, middle school, and high school that don't exist at preschool. So in our work in schools, we use multiple sources of information. The program quality measure, the APERS, we use the learner's IEP, the teacher's understanding, and the parent's understanding information about learner strengths, interests, and history, and then the teacher's experience. All of those blend into a decision-making process that leads to the selection and implementation of evidence-based practices. So we first build quality, we gather information from a variety of sources, and then make a plan on strategies that may be most useful for students in programs. And we feel like, and have some evidence, some data that shows that following this process leads to a promotion of program quality. For one thing, that is, we see changes on the APERS when we work with teachers and other service providers and programs, and also growth for students accomplishing goals that were established by teachers and family members and other service providers. So, in conclusion, the evidence-based practices and the APERS are tools that we use when we work with teachers in programs for students with ASD, and that school systems may or other service providers may use in providing effective programs. But we can't expect that teachers and practitioners will begin to be able to use practices after one presentation or after hearing about evidence-based practices and being pointed toward resources. We feel that sustained implementation or sustained use and effective use really requires several things. First, it requires the tools, and we've talked about some of those tools today. Second, it requires training, and training beyond a single workshop that may occur. Third, it requires coaching, ongoing communication with individuals who can provide feedback about strategies that were selected. And fourth, in administrative support. In the programs that have worked best for us, we found that when there's support within the building from principals, assistant principals, also other teachers, that practices are used well and students make great progress. So that concludes my part of the presentation today.